The Charles Adler Show starts now.
So, as always, it's great to have you. And as always, I'm very excited about bringing on our next guest. You'll meet her in just a moment. She also is hosting a podcast that is extremely well known right across the country. That's all I'll tease you with right now, except to say that Charles Adler Show is available on Apple, Google, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. So be sure to hit the follow. This is all important to all of us. Hit the follow or the subscribe button to get the episode at once. Thank you again. And without further ado, known best as a face of the National and many other tremendous CBC programs over the years. She's a national icon, and she's now the host of her own podcast along with the great Maureen Holloway. It's called A Woman of Ill Repute. This is Wendy Mesley about to join us. Wendy, it's great to have you. This is the very first time we're having you on our podcast, and I hope it's the first of several appearances.
That would be great. It's kind of weird to be in this position. I'm normally the one asking the questions, but here you are, and I'm known as the victim, I guess.
All right. Well, I tend not to treat anyone as a victim, but if it makes you feel better,
no, that's good.
Nice. Listen, I'm on both sides of the business. Sometimes I'm asking questions, sometimes I'm answering. So I'm good with either. If you want to pause at some point and start asking me questions, I'm good with that.
Oh, I may have a question or two for you. We did somebody, and he sort of was like, "Oh, you and Maureen, you're like a big deal, and so let me ask you questions." I'm like, "Wait a minute, this is our podcast. We get to ask you questions." So you start.
So naturally, I have to ask about the name of it. The podcast is called A Woman of Ill Repute.
Women of Ill Repute.
Okay, I've got my apologies. I've got woman on my screen. Women of Ill Repute. Pardon me for exposing myself as a thoughtless bingo caller. I'm reading what's on the screen. So Women of Ill Repute is what the podcast is called, and the women are Wendy and Maureen. I get that there are many people who are in their 20s and 30s and 40s who may not even be familiar with the ancient term women of ill repute. If you can give us a little bit of history and a little bit of the present and why you're calling it what you are.
Well, we've never actually charged, so we're not prostitutes who charge for services. So it wasn't really about that. So yeah, Women of Ill Repute used to be what you would call sex workers, but that's not us. But we started off wanting to talk to people who were other women, well, because we see ourselves as women of ill repute, which we think is a compliment. And I think nearly every woman that we've spoken to, and I'm sure there are lots that we haven't spoken to who would disagree, but I think every woman, if not most men, see themselves as someone of ill repute. And so by that, we mean it to be a compliment. We mean that me and Maureen are kind of women of ill repute and proud of it. And we started out talking to people who were controversial. So, whether it was Jen Agg, who wrote a book about being a bitch in the restaurant industry, or Marie Hennen, who fought for Jian Ghomeshi. She's a criminal defense lawyer, and she talked about the duties of being a criminal defense lawyer, but it was controversial. She was called a traitor to women by a lot of women because of what happened in the court case. And then gradually we just decided that we really liked doing the podcast. And so we've kept going, and Maureen and I are happy to be the Women of Ill Repute. And there's been a few men. You should come on too, Charles.
Well, I'll be happy to. I just need to know whether or not I can answer the skill testing questions. If someone like Maureen Holloway or Wendy Mesley asks, Charles, why are you a man of ill repute? I mean, at the moment, I'm still in thoughtless bingo caller mode. I don't know how to respond to that.
Well, I know that you called people at CBC bingo callers at one point. I think you said that we regurgitate. Well, I actually would like to differ with that because anyway, maybe I'm leaping ahead into a discussion about CBC or journalism or whatever. We're probably going to go there somewhere because we're both journalists. And you actually used to be on a CBC column with me, a panel.
Yes.
Before I became a woman of ill repute, even though I've always been one. So yeah, so you charge, you just don't tell anyone. Is that
okay?
Is that...
Well, I was proud to be proud to be on the panel. And I honestly, I don't keep track of who's getting charged and who isn't. So I honestly don't remember.
Aha.
I honestly don't remember whether I was paid for that one. I've got other people, fortunately, in my life taking care of all of that. And as far as I can tell, my credit cards still work, and no one's asking me to evict the place. So I guess everything is getting paid for. But as far as the ill repute business is concerned, so if I'm asked, why are you on Wendy and Maureen's show? Why are you a man of ill repute? My answer is, I used to be a panelist on Wendy's CBC show. Is that the answer?
No, I'm trying to figure out whether you actually ever charged for the act,
Oh, I see.
the act. But
No.
I think I was being facetious. No, I think you are a man or a person of ill repute if you've stirred the waters a little bit, which I think is most people, and you definitely have stirred a few waters.
I've stirred a few waters. So let's get into the conversation you clearly wanted to get into a few moments ago. I've called the odd CBC reader bingo callers. I've also said that we need bingo callers. We need exceptional people to write the copy, and exceptional people who can perform it, read it. You were one of them. There were many other jobs you did.
I was never a bingo caller.
You were never okay. Well, all right. So help me with this. When you're anchoring the newscast, the national, and you're reading the wonderful material that is in your prompter, what is it about that you object to when I say bingo caller?
It makes me think of a conversation. I used to work, when I worked on the Hill, which was eons ago, but it feels like yesterday, Parliament Hill in Ottawa. And then I used to work often 7 days a week. And then I moved to Toronto, and it was really easy. I only did 6 days a week. And then someone said, well, why don't you do the whatever show, national show? And I said, I don't know. I'm already working like 60, 70 hours a week. And they're just like, you just show up and you just read the copy. And I'm like, you know me, like that is never going to happen. So even when I did the national, when Peter Mansbridge did the national, which was basically what I saw for 25 years before I started. Well, some of those years I was anchoring as well on weekends. You go in hours ahead of time. You see every single word. And if you don't like the words, you rewrite them. You write some of them yourselves. You see the stories yourselves. You know about all the stories. You anchor election night where you actually have to know stuff.
Okay, I'm guilty. Guilty as charged. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So
I feel so bad. I feel so bad. I've done so many gigs, and I've done some on private TV where the stuff was written down, put my prompter. And I felt like this was just a kind of a room service gig. And I thought of myself as a bingo caller. And maybe I was just projecting. I did not realize that you went through every single word and edited and rewrote and did journalism.
Well, I'm not sure that happens everywhere. Like I do. And I do, like I obviously had problems with CBC. But I do think that CBC journalists are a little bit different. And it used to be that anchors were a little bit different. And I remember one time I was sitting at a journalists' dinner thing, and the head of CBC basically reached out to me and was from the private sector and was very much of I was giving the big speech about how, journalists matter, and we've all been in the field and we've all done this, and we all really care about the story, and we read and we know. And she's just like, yeah, but you're just talent. Like, just show up. Just show up and read what's in the be a bingo caller. And I'm like, no. But
I have done so many different kinds of journalism, and I guess, frankly, reading the prompter was something that just came naturally. I was able to do that when I was basically a child. So maybe I just don't take it serious enough, or I don't take seriously enough the idea that some people do spend hours and hours going over it, and maybe even rewriting it before they read it. But it's now settled social science, Wendy Mesley. I will never call you a former bingo caller. How's that?
Okay, thank you.
All right.
I've never even played bingo, but who knows?
All right. Well, that's another thing that you and I differ on. I happen to love bingo. Yeah, some of my best memories are my mom taking me to a place in St. Agathe, which is the Laurentians, about an hour north of Montreal, and she got 1 week of the year off. She was a factory worker, and we were, renting a room. We got a great price on a room in St. Agathe, and once a week we would go to the Castle des Monts, which was made famous in a Mordecai Richler book, and we were allowed to play bingo for 1 penny for every 2 cards. So basically half a penny a card. Anyway, it's just an old story. I don't see bingo as one of those disparaging words. I actually love bingo in all manners and forms. But I want to get to the podcast that you and Maureen Holloway are doing, but I'm not going to do that before I ask you to talk a little bit about Maureen Holloway and why she's your partner in crime, as it were.
Well, you were briefly on a panel, but before that, it was somebody on a panel, John Moore, who's the morning guy at CJAD and or at CKFM, but he was at CJAD, and I think you were there a couple of years ago, perhaps. And he introduced us because I was saying, "Hey, John, we should. You're funny and smart. We should do dinner." And he says, "Well, I've got a friend who's actually I think you'd really get along." And so the 6 of us, with our partners, had dinner, and Maureen and I had a couple glasses of wine, and then that was the end of that. That was just like, "I love you. You're so funny. You're so smart." And then a year later, she, well, I guess a year later, I left CBC, and then a year after that, she left CHFI. And then a year after that, we started doing the podcast together. And we were just going to do 6 or 8. Let's just talk to a bunch of people and have some fun and try it out and see where it goes. And here we are. It's been more than a year. We've got 1,000. We've got 50 episodes, I think.
Yeah, John Moore is someone I've always respected. He was at CJAD, my old alma mater. He's now at CFRB, also my old alma mater, but of course now it's called News Talk 1010. He's a very well respected, highly rated morning person who will never be called a bingo caller. Wendy, as far as Maureen is concerned, Maureen does have a history, not just a great history in highly rated radio, but she was a stand-up comedian for a while, was she not?
Yeah, so that's it's funny because everybody's had crushes on like movie stars and singers and all that. I never really did. And part of it was because I very early on became a news junkie and sort of devoted every moment to that. But the only crushes I ever had were on comedians, and whether it was Robin Williams or whoever it was growing up. Saturday Night Live started when I was in high school, and so that was a major attraction for me. But it's also created a little bit of a problem because she's a huge pop culture nerd. She knows everything about pop culture, and I don't know. I'm a moron basically when it comes to that.
No, you're not a moron. You're a news nerd.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I would frame it.
So a news nerd and comedy nerd, or a news nerd and pop culture nerd, have great chemistry over a glass of wine and over a hot podcast microphone. What's been the most difficult thing about growing the podcast?
There's lots of things, but the most interesting thing I think is sticking to the Maureen theme is I've never really I've been part of a team before, but I've never had like an actual never is a big word, but I've mostly never had a co-host. And so like we have to make decisions together. So that's like, no wonder you're all by yourself. It'd be so much easier.
So does I don't mean to probe too much here, but does that mean that there is the odd flame out, maybe the odd argument? Does anyone have to kind of put the fire hose to the two of you to get along?
Oh yeah, no. Someone actually said to me, I find it really weird because on most podcasts or most radio or media presentations or whatever, the hosts are always, "Oh, you're great. No, you're so great. No, you're so great." And yeah, exactly what she said is exactly right. So we don't do that. Well, we've had a couple of moments that have been mostly driven by her love of pop culture and my ignorance of it, and my devotion to journalism and her devotion to something else, but to comedy and performing. But mostly like we love each other and we work stuff out, but we also, if we disagree about stuff, we talk about it, which is apparently not normal.
Right. So in TV, when you were at the CBC, did they ever try to partner you with anyone? Did you ever try to get you to co-host a show? I'm just wondering if that was ever proposed and how it might have worked out.
Not really. When I was a reporter, which was a big chunk of my life, I was a reporter in Montreal and Quebec City and Ottawa and Toronto. And then I started doing interviews and anchoring the National, and I did Marketplace. I did a show called Undercurrents for 5 years. Marketplace, I had a co-host, but we kind of did our own thing. So Erica Johnson was my co-host, and she's still there. She's amazing. We got along really, really well. But no, I never really had a partner. I had teams, but and now I have no team, but except for Matt Kundle, who helps out.
Matt is the greatest human being on earth. We're all totally dependent on Matt Kundle. I don't know whether we could get any of these podcasts off the ground without him. So we're all very, very grateful to the great Matt. Also, I guess an ex Montrealer. So Wendy, you spent time in Montreal as a professional, but are you from Ontario?
Well, it's kind of complicated. So I was born in Montreal. So I could go back anytime. It officially separates. I can say, well, I was born here, I can come in. But my parents split when I was a baby. He was gay and she wasn't. And so that obviously didn't work. And so I grew up in Toronto. So my mom brought me back to Toronto when I was a baby. And then I guess I went on a school trip or something to Quebec City, and I was like, oh, I have to work here someday. And then I went to Ryerson to study journalism when I was older, obviously. And there were a bunch of people came in. They used to have like summer jobs where you got paid instead of the intern things that happen now at some places. And one of them was in Montreal, and they were like, it was for CFCF, CTV's affiliate there. And they said, well, do you speak French? And I said, un petit peu, or un petit peu. Because I thought, Pierre Trudeau was prime minister and it's all bilingual, so I can probably get away with this, and didn't think it was that French at all. But it turned out it was pretty French. So, but I got the job and I moved to CFCF in Montreal. And then ultimately, after 2 or 3 years, I covered the first referendum, which is kind of ridiculous for a person from Toronto who basically doesn't speak much French. I didn't cover it very well or very deeply. I was on the edges, but I remember just speaking English in 1979 and 1980 and 81. And then I moved to Quebec City. And by that point, I was speaking some French. And within a couple of months, I was really speaking French because there ain't no English in Quebec City. And the premier was René Lévesque. So it was it was a fascinating time. And I thought, why does nobody else want this job? Why is there no competition? But anyway, that's how I got it. These days, I would not get the job not speaking French.
Do they still have a sign up on the highway right beside Bienvenue at Quebec? Ain't no English. Is there an ain't no English sign on the road?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
But it feels that way when you're in Quebec City, that's for sure. So, Wendy, I wanted to ask you. I actually wanted to ask a number of CBC people this question. Maybe I've been a little bit on the shy side, but need to ask. Well, it's just that I grew up. Obviously listening to private sector and public sector, and in general, I mean, this is going to offend a number of people in the private sector, my fellow private sector broadcasters, but I'm going to ask anyway. Is there a rule at CBC where you got to jack up the Queen's English, or I guess today we'd have to say the King's English? Do you have to improve your King's English a little bit when you walk through the CBC gate?
I don't know, but apparently I have amazing elocution. So, they probably never pointed it out to me. No. Although at Radio-Canada, a friend of mine who probably does not want to be identified is a Franco-Ontarian, and the accent was not acceptable. So I don't know. So I think it may exist in at French CBC. I never knew about it, but yes, I think 1,000 years ago, which you and I would remember, unfortunately, there were. You would listen to CBC radio announcers, and they all had a perfect accent. And, so I'm not sure that that's the case anymore.
Well, I'll tell you why I was grateful to CBC outside of Barbara Frum, and I'm sure people are tired of my Barbara Frum story. My father hero worshiped Barbara Frum, the only 90 minutes of the day where I wasn't allowed to say anything to my dad. It was when Barbara Frum was on. That's the Queen, and and was to be respectful and keep my beak shut. But outside of the Barbara From thing, I'm convinced that CBC helped my father, and for him, English was his second language, helped him speak English. He was just an immigrant like many other immigrants. He didn't speak a word of English, and I'm positive that listening to the perfect pronunciation, the perfect elocution of CBC announcers, whether they were reading the news or doing anything else, I'm positive that contributed not just, and I wouldn't mention it if it was just my dad. I have a feeling that millions of Canadians who were new to the country were, using CBC as just a very, very reliable utility to learn how to speak English.
It's funny because now, well, first of all, I have to say that Barbara From was my idol. My mom raised me on her own, and so that was sort of adult dinner company was Barbara, and listening to Barbara, and she's so great. I mean, I'm sure she was human and had her flaws like everybody else, but when I was a kid growing up, that's who I wanted to be. I realized I couldn't be Robin Williams, but maybe I could be Barbara From. But the English thing is fascinating, and I think that is how a lot of people learn to speak a new language. Like my daughter she's 24. She was working and then decided that she wanted to stay in Montreal. She went to school in Montreal, university, and now has decided she wants to stay there. And that's what she does, or at least that's what everybody tells her she should do, is listen to radio, like listen to French radio, and that's how you'll learn the language. And I think that is how people learn and adapt, and they learn about a culture and they also learn about a language.
I don't know if in the halls of CBC ever got to meet Rex Loring, but Rex, I thought of Rex as sort of my dad's English professor. He'd listen to Rex Loring every morning doing the World at 8. And I bumped into his daughter, Elaine, many years later. And I remember thanking Elaine for her father, if she could pass on a good word to her father.
Yeah,
for
I never
teaching
knew
my dad.
him.
Teaching my dad how to speak English. And then there was another fellow who had perfect Rex Loring-like execution. I think his name was Russ St. Germain, unless I'm...
Russ Germain. Oh, yeah. No, I remember him. I don't remember Rex Loring, but I remember meeting his daughter and knew that it was like I was in the halls of greatness. And
there was a woman who also had perfect elocution who would read the news during the supper hour for a number of years, and her name was Barb Smith. Don't know if that name rings a bell.
Yeah, well, I kind of got lost when I was in Montreal and Quebec City for a while, so I don't know whether that was before or after, but
no, that's fine. Anyway, I want to move on from the CBC to ask this question: is there life, Wendy Mesley? Is there life after CBC?
Well, leaving was difficult. I was called all kinds of things, which I don't think I am. And my employer of 40 years did not stand up for me. So leaving CBC earlier than I'd planned was not, it was really difficult. But there is life. There is life after CBC. And it's wonderful to do a podcast now with Maureen, Women of Ill Repute, plug, where I don't have an overlord, so I don't have a boss. Like everybody always asks, one of the favorite questions I'm sure you get asked is, so are you told what to say? Is it all, is it not the bingo calling thing, but are you told to support the prime minister of the day or whatever? But that's always one of the questions. And so, no.
You mean you're not? You're not told what to say?
I'm a bingo. I just regurgitate everything. Yes, I just.
Listen, it's not just a CBC thing. When I was seen as, a voice of conservatism, I'd always be asked, so do you clear your stuff with Stephen Harper or Brian Mulroney? I mean, and I always thought those questions were ridiculous. And of course, in recent years, where I've had my issues with the Conservatives, people say, well, are you clearing your stuff with Justin Trudeau? Are you trying to make sure that, and I guess there's just kind of the easiest way to make a point without any evidence at all, just have people kind of believe it because, they kind of lean that way, many people do, is to say that the media takes its orders from the government or from a political party, and the media is just saying those things because they're, sucking up to the people who pay them. I don't think that anybody's ever produced evidence. I mean, I used to very, I guess, boldly, or even some would say arrogantly say, if you can prove that I'm taking any money from the government for what I say. I'll give you $100,000. I'll give you your favorite charity $100,000. And some people thought that was a bit on the arrogant side, especially coming from a person who sees himself as a common person. So I shrunk the reward. I shrunk it down to $5,000. And of course that still stands. If anyone can prove that what I say is being cleared by a prime minister or someone working for a prime minister, then fill your boots. I'd be happy to turn over $5,000 to you or your favorite charity if you can prove that. I don't tend to get offended by stuff like that, Wendy, because it is just ignorant, and it's usually someone who's just following someone who's following someone that they tend to respect. And when someone that they tend to respect says something like that, they just kind of take their word for it. But do you get, personally or professionally, offended when someone accuses you of regurgitating what some politician wants you to say?
Well, now, CBC used to get attacked a lot, and you and I, we can have another argument if you want about objectivity, because I actually believe in objectivity, and the whole place where news is now. I would hardly be the first to talk about polarization and how people are sort of made to see each other as enemies, which and I think objectivity is important, and actually is a tool to fend that off. But the whole idea of I sort of have opinions that I'm like, even talking about my dad being gay. Like, I never talked about that until I had a podcast. I also, my mom died, and it was kind of her secret. So I didn't want to tell it before then, but I do feel that that these days there is very much a dividing line put between people that doesn't need to be there.
Well, it's interesting. Many years ago, when I did consider the so-called gay issue, homosexuality, controversial, it was difficult for me to call it or think of it as controversial, because I grew up in Montreal, where it was just so mainstream, especially for those of us who grew up in theater. However, I did understand once I moved to Toronto the Good that the gay issue was a much more controversial thing, and it's still controversial as far as some folks are concerned. But one of the things I used to say, in the days when I used to have to, as an opinion person, to advocate for equal marriage, or what some people call same-sex marriage, and the business of gay people being openly gay. I used to say there are many families where people are living in the closet, they're living a lie, and it hurts people. In the case of gay men in the closet, it hurts their wife, it hurts their son, it hurts their daughter. And here comes Wendy Mesley. I had no idea that you had the background that you've talked about here on this podcast, but I was basically talking about you. I don't mean to speak for you, but I'm wondering, now that we've come to this particular bridge that I wish to cross with you, Wendy Mesley, was I saying the right thing or the wrong thing in saying that closeted gay men are not doing their kids any favors?
I think it's for every person to decide. So I'm sure there are people who would disagree with you. But it was interesting. I read up about you because, I was going to be on this podcast, and I'd read about you before and wanted you on the panel on CBC years ago, because I think you're a smart person and you're a well-known person. But I asked Matt about I read about how, you're raised by a family that was persecuted during the Holocaust, and that equality has been a huge deal for you. But I had always sort of seen you as a very strong conservative voice. And then it seemed to change. And I asked Matt, and he said, I don't know. So what happened? Did you have a change of heart? Because right now you don't feel like a super capital C conservative.
Well, but in terms of what the rhetoric you hear from conservatives today, I'm definitely not a good fit. I had a flame out with Jason Kenney, and some of it was around the issue that Jason Kenney was, I felt, having a ridiculously hard time dealing with. One was simply to apologize for stuff that he had done when he was very, very much an anti-gay social conservative activist in San Francisco, where he was part of a movement to try to prevent, and they actually succeeded for a while, preventing gay men in hospices, dying in hospices, from getting to see their partners, their lovers. It was to a point where their partners and lovers weren't even allowed to attend their funerals. I just thought that was just so slimy, so ridiculous, so beneath the pale. And I thought that it might be an idea for Jason Kenney to apologize for something in his past, and he said he didn't want to, and we got into a bit of a public row. And so Carol Off, and as it happens, asked me on the show, and they asked me where this deep feeling about equality comes from, and why did I have a particular feeling for the LGBT community. And I said it probably comes from being the child of Holocaust survivors, and reading about it when I was very, very young. And it's clear to me that my grandparents and the LGBT people ended up in the same chimney. So it's hard not to feel for that community. And I can't be positive because there's no teleprompter in my brain telling me what to say and what to read. But my conscience tells me that that's impacted on me on the issue of equality, not just equality, people who were involved in the Holocaust, but just equality everywhere. And I just feel that people, whether they're far right or far left, oftentimes play the race card or the gender card or the sex card. And so whether it's men and women, LGBT and everybody else, equality is a very big thing with me. And when equal marriage became controversial, I couldn't understand why it was controversial, because I couldn't understand why it was the government's business whether a woman married a woman or a woman married a man. My thought was that this is about love, and why would the government get in the way of love? And what about the 1960s and 70s, when we were told by Pierre Trudeau and most people, at least most people in my life, stood up and applauded when he said that the government has no business in the nation's bedrooms. So that's probably a longer answer than you were looking for, but I think that gives you a sense of where I'm coming from on equality.
Well, I think equality is important, and now it seems like I don't know. This comes back to the "where are we now" kind of in news, in journalism question, but I think now we are kind of pitted together, pitted against each other, and everyone is, we had someone screaming at the prime minister that he was a pedophile, or that, gay stuff. Like, why is all of this? It just never seems to go away. We always need something to wedge, I suppose, people against each other, but it just seems it's completely out of whack.
Well, all the pedophile stuff and the gays, all of that is coming from sources that want to feed anger, especially, I have to say it, angry men.
Yeah.
And, that's what angry men want to be angry about right now. I mean, you say transgender to an angry man and just sets his hair on fire.
I live near Belleville, which is where the prime minister was recently, where he was called a pedophile by some angry person. And we went to see Oppenheimer, the movie, and we went for a bite of seafood before. And right across the street, there was a Tammy's wig and mastectomy shop. Next to that, there was a Pathfinders for Independence, which is people who need help because they've got brain injuries. Next to that was the Salvation Army. Next to that was, like, people in Belleville, they're suffering. Everybody is suffering. So I'm not saying that excuses somebody in Belleville then saying you're a pedophile. But boy, we got a lot of issues. Isn't this a happy note? Don't you find this is really a happy discussion?
Okay, so let me ask you this. I mean, just hypothetically, you put two news people, or let's call them former news people, into a conversation and say, guys, go for 30, 45 minutes, go for an hour if you like. Are you someone who would think that could never end up going into any landmines or into any discussions that maybe even border on the depressing side? Because don't news people always end up going to some bad news?
Well, yeah. I mean, I used to always argue that if the plane landed well, it was not a story. So of course, where the plane blows up, we're going to talk about it. So there is no such thing as happy news. But I think people do like that. It was funny this morning. We were talking about seeking controversy. This morning, Maureen and I did an interview that's going to run down the road with Sheila McCarthy, who was in Women Talking. And I was like, where was all the tension? Like, what about all the love for the men? What about the women who thought they should leave and the women who thought they should go after they were drugged and raped and all of these horrible things happened in the movie, or not in the movie, but in real life that the movie was about? And Maureen was like, "Oh yeah," and then they could call it women fighting. But I would probably, as a journalist, find that more interesting.
Now, I need to ask on Women of Ill Repute, and that's the podcast that Wendy Mesley hosts along with Maureen Holloway. Plug. Women of Ill Repute. And this is the Charles Adler Show podcast. Plug. So, Wendy, have you and Maureen ever ended up fighting on the podcast to the point where you later asked Matt Kundle, Matt, please do us a favor. You may think this is entertaining as hell, but it's not something we want. Please edit it out. Has that ever happened?
No, that's never happened. She sometimes says I'm full of shit, and vice versa, and very politely, of course. And we've had a couple of fights, but they haven't been recorded, and Matt's been left out of the picture. And the fights are usually about, I see the world as a journalist, and which is different than the way that a comedian or a morning host sees the world. And so it's just learning to understand each other. So it's, but we love each other. So it's, we always work it out, not on the air.
Right. Well, you do believe in objective truth, and I applaud you for that. And I don't mean to ask you to speak for Maureen, but does Maureen, former stand-up comedian and controversial host of many highly rated radio shows, does Maureen believe in objective truth?
You'd have to ask her, but I think she'd think a joke is more important.
Yes. And I probably think an opinion is more important. I mean, I don't doubt that there's something called objective reality, and we talk about it in terms of mathematics and science, but I do think the average person, no matter how hard they're trying to be fair and equitable and honorable and dignified and all those things, I just think the average person is still looking at most things through some sort of subjective lens based on their own set of experiences. Would you at least compromise with me on that one?
I would, I read the Globe and Mail and I go to the opinion section first. So yes, I find that much more interesting. They happen to be people that I admire and mostly and agree with. So but on the other hand, I would say that that's where we're getting all of our news these days, is of people who have opinions. Oh, I like this person, so I'll follow that person. And then we're led down that path. And I'm not talking about the Globe and Mail. I'm talking about other people. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just it's lovely. It's lovely to see your face and to have more than, I think, on our panel on when I was back at CBC. I think you're on for like 3 minutes, so it's nice to talk to you.
Maybe
more.
I may have had 3 minutes of face time, maybe two, somewhere between 2 and 3. So when we talk about opinions, you used to be on Twitter. At least I used to notice you on Twitter. Have you disappeared, or have you just kind of toned it down? But how much Twitter or X does Wendy Mesley do right now?
Isn't it called Elon now?
Well, some people think of it that way.
Yeah, no, I'm still on Twitter, and I still post stuff, but it's mostly about the podcast. I've never really been very personal or very opinionated, and this is a disagreement, a pleasant disagreement that I have with Maureen, because she has a personal account and she puts out whatever she feels like putting out, and I'm just like, I don't know, I've never let the people into my house to like take pictures of my great design sense, when really they just want to say, this is Wendy's house. So I've never done that, and she's like, get over yourself. So yeah, there's probably a truth somewhere in the middle there.
Well, I think, when you talk about me being interesting and all that, I think you got interested in my stuff on Twitter. Am I wrong about that?
No, it's on Twitter. Yeah, but you express opinions and I don't. So maybe I should.
Well, listen, you live whichever life you want to live. We admire you a hell of a lot. And most of us got to know you watching you on CBC with that perfect elocution, which I always envied. I just want to thank you so much for this, and I hope we can do this again.
Why, thank you, Charles. No, thank you very much. It's been lovely to talk to you, and all the best of luck with the podcast, because it's sort of new, right?
Yeah, it's almost out of the box. I want to thank you for this, of course, and I also want to wish you and Maureen all the best with Women of Ill Repute, your podcast on Apple and Spotify and Google and everywhere one can
Wherever
get
you get your podcast.
You bet. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Charles. Bye.
Wendy Mesley joining us from Southern Ontario. I want to thank you for being with us. And yes, you can get us on all those platforms and more. And please remember to push the follow or subscribe button when you join us on any podcast. When you do that, they let you know immediately when Matt Kundle helps us put a fresh podcast together and put it up on the platform. I'm Charles Adler.
Catch Charles Adler Mondays on Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson, twice a week in the Winnipeg Free Press, and every day at criermedia.co.